I'm Pat Morton. I'm Associate Professor in Media and Cultural Studies Department and Chair of the Urban Studies Program at the University of California, Riverside. And I'm incredibly pleased to be here amongst many of my mentors and favorite colleagues. Thank you. Like always, I want to thank Irina and Mary for organizing the event. This is a really wonderful critical examination, and I'm very much enjoying the paper so far. In this session, we will look critically at Alan's incisive work on one of his central concerns, historicism. And we've heard something about it already in relationship to meaning, but we'll be looking at several critical essays. And I'm just going to give them chronologically with dates, because I'm a historian. So Historicism and the Limits of Semiology, 1972, about which we've heard already. Rules, Realism, History, 1976. E.H. Gombrich and the Hegelian Tradition, 1981. And finally, Three Kinds of Historicism from 1983, on which at least one of the speakers is going to focus. And as we've already heard, beginning with Historicism and the Limits of Semiology, Alan examined the evolution of his own thinking in some ways, his own principles, and began to develop a method which he employed in subsequent writing. Although, of course, as we've also seen, there are twists and turns in that development. But the difference between linguistic and aesthetic discourses formed the basis for much of his later thinking and really informs then his discussion of historicism. And also his confrontation with eclecticism, a central precedent, of course, for what became postmodernism, is another important aspect that underlies these essays. So in the following papers, we'll see how Alan's work can be framed and interpreted in contemporary scholarship, even read against the grain, I would say, and to see the degree to which other contexts can test ideas that Alan developed in his essays. And we can also look at what's left out of Alan's essays. His work is equally important as what's explicitly present. So to begin with, I'd like to introduce Nikos Magouliotis, who's a PhD student at the ETH Zurich, at the ETH, and the Institute for the History and Theory of Architecture. Nikos.
Hi, let me share my screen. So here we go. I hope you can all see that. Thank you, Pat, for the introduction. Thank you, Irina and Mary, for this wonderful invitation. I'm going to repeat what the youngest of the speakers today said, which is that I'm honored and humbled to be invited to speak among such distinguished guests. And I'm also going to repeat Leah Catherine's disclaimer. I can definitely not claim to be an expert on Alan Colquhoun's work, but I was prompted to read him and to read him closely because of the invitation to this event. And this opportunity, or this very fertile chance, I owe again to Mary and Irina. And I also want to thank Hvattum for the very encouraging comments on a draft of what you're about to hear. So let me begin. Alan Colquhoun's text, Three Kinds of Historicism, first published in 1983, was a critical response to the postmodern currents of his time. However, this critique began with an intricate analysis of the 18th and 19th century as a period in which European historiography and architecture moved from classicism to historicism. Colquhoun summarizes the classicist mindset of the 18th century as one in which nature was the only legitimate measure of cultural values, and human nature was considered as having been always and everywhere the same. Consequently, the laws of art and architecture were considered as immutable and universal, and identified almost exclusively with Greco-Roman classical ideal, a view that Colquhoun deemed absolutist. From the late 18th century onwards, this classicist paradigm was challenged by historicism, which Colquhoun defines as, among other things, he defines it as a growing sense of historical and cultural relativity. According to Colquhoun, historicism acknowledged that human reason and human culture were not immutable, abstract truths, and that they were bound to historical circumstances and social customs which evolved over time and differed from one place to another. This relativism appeared, as Colquhoun explains, first in the realm of historiography, but eventually affected the practice of art and architecture. As Colquhoun explains, by the late 18th century, the range of cultural models available to architects had expanded vastly, from the art and architecture of the Middle Ages to those of non-European cultures, alongside an ever-increasing understanding of the different architectures of ancient civilizations. Thus, the monopoly of the classical gave way to a new possibility of choice among different styles, leading to the historicist architecture of the 19th century. Colquhoun's thematization of the 18th and 19th century as a period of transition from classicism to historicism is, of course, by now an established theme in European architectural history. My interest in this topic comes from my own doctoral research on the Greek architecture of the 18th and 19th centuries and the transition of the Greek context from the Ottoman era to that of the Greek nation state. My starting point, however, is a feeling of disjunction or discrepancy, which arises whenever I try to project Colquhoun's scheme onto the Greek context. Let me try to unpack this. Now, if for much of Europe, the long 19th century was the period in which the monopoly of classicism was challenged by the discovery of other artistic paradigms or other pasts, for Greece, this was the period in which classicism dominated the production and theoretical discourse, marginalizing any other choice of style. The Greek nation state was established in 1830 with the appointment of the Bavarian Otto as its king and the arrival of numerous European archaeologists, architects, and planners. For these new intellectual authorities of Greece, the ruins of classical antiquity were the undisputable foundation of a modern Greek and Western national identity, and the obvious way to shake off 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. Greece had been part of the Ottoman Empire for the entirety of the early modern period. From 1453 until 1830, its art and architecture had limited contact with the Western rediscoveries of classical antiquity, whether that was the Renaissance or classicism in the 18th century. With the foundation of the Greek state in the early 19th century, classicism was introduced in post-Ottoman Greece as a complete rupture with any local precedent. More importantly, classicism arrived in Greece at a time when in Europe, the monopoly of the classical, as I said previously, was being challenged. Goethe's emblematic text Von Deutscher Baukunst in 1773, with its romantic apotheosis of the Cathedral of Strasbourg, triggered a new appreciation of Gothic art and architecture and paved the way for the neo-medievalisms of the 19th century. In Greece, however, the acceptance of the local medieval heritage of Byzantium was anything but unanimous. Adamantios Korais, a man whose writings laid the ideological foundation of modern Greek nationhood, was famous for dismissing the Byzantine heritage. The case in point is his text, A Dialogue Between Two Greeks, published in 1805, which was written as a didactic conversation between a Christian commoner named Kleanthis and an enlightened intellectual named Aristocles. Kleanthis expressed admiration and affection for Hagia Sophia in Istanbul as symbol of Greek religion and nationhood. But Aristocles refuted him by recounting the troubled history of the Byzantine monument. He pointed out that the Emperor Justinian gathered the money needed for this expensive construction by making significant cuts from funds otherwise destined for public education, and therefore leading the people of the empire to cultural stagnation. Aristocles gave the final ideological blow to the monument by saying, and I read the quote you see on the screen, "The glorious edifice of Hagia Sophia, my friend," talking to Kleanthis, "is the reason why neither you nor many of us modern Greeks can understand the wise language of our ancient forefathers." If, in other words, for Goethe, the Strasbourg Cathedral was a symbolic artifact that connected the modern Germans with their medieval ancestors, for Korais, Hagia Sophia was the obstacle between the modern Greeks and their glorified ancient past. And the history of its construction was not told as a national saga, but as a cautionary tale for the emerging Greek nation state. So the Greek nation state was established right around the time that Heinrich Hübsch posed his emblematic historicist question, in what style should we build? In Europe, this led many architects to a deviation from the classicist paradigm and to varying degrees of stylistic pluralism. In Greece, the situation was again different. The architects of the Greek nation state came from all over Europe, and many had in fact been trained in academies where such new historicist ideas would have been known. The majority of their built work appears to be uniformly and categorically classicist. From the King's Palace to the Parliament, from the university, the academy, and the library to the Polytechnic and the observatory, and several churches, the vast majority of public buildings erected in Athens from 1830 onwards were designed in a neoclassical style. There were, of course, exceptions, projects that made use of medieval styles, such as this one, such as the Metropolitan Cathedral of Athens, designed by Greek architect Dimitrios Zezos in what was then called the, quote, Greco-Byzantine style, end quote. Contemporaneous with Léon Vaudoyer's Byzantinesque cathedral in Marseille and with many other neo-Gothic churches across Europe, Zezos's Neo-Byzantine project was symptomatic of its time. But in Greece, it was met with fierce criticism. One anonymous author protested in a newspaper in 1857, and I read what you see on the screen. What a disgrace it is for one to see such architectural abominations, and where? In the city of Athens, opposite the Propyle, opposite the Parthenon, the Erechtheion. We are trying, it seems, to surpass the Byzantines in tastelessness, instead of having as our models the wonderful works of our immortal forefathers, meaning the ancient Greeks. All in all, Neo-Byzantine projects in 19th century Athens were rare, but what was even more rare was a theoretical discourse on architectural historicism or romanticism. Zezos, for instance, the designer of the Athens Cathedral and the only architect of the period who experimented persistently with this Byzantine style, never published a theoretical defense of his contested designs. The few Greek architects that did write theoretical texts in the 19th century defended classicism or neoclassicism as the only legitimate option for the new national architecture. The most vocal of these classicists was the Greek architect Lysandros Kaftanzoglou. Serving as dean of the country's first Royal School of the Arts from 1844 to 1862, Kaftanzoglou preached his ideas through annual speeches that were attended by students, local architects, and even the king. In one of these speeches in 1845, the architect summarized the long history of art and architecture in Greece through a rather reductive classicist scope. Essentially, he argued that Greek art had flourished in antiquity, but then ever since fell in decay throughout the Byzantine and the Ottoman era. Kaftanzoglou presented the foundation of the Greek state in 1830 as a turning point, a moment in which, as he said, the art that had been exiled since so many centuries was returning again to its ancient home. Essentially, he was legitimizing the import of European classicism as the natural homecoming of something indigenous. Very often, Kaftanzoglou referred to this return, quote unquote, return of classicism to Greece in the 19th century as a renaissance, a somewhat anachronistic reference which he made explicit in another speech in 1871. Just like the Italian artists of the 14th and 15th century molded and shaped the new Italian art of the Renaissance from the monuments of old Rome, so should we, the Greeks of today, order and regulate our national architecture, first by tracing the rules of the ancient Greek art as they are salvaged in Vitruvius, and then by examining the orders and the ratios of harmony that can be observed in the surviving Greek monuments. Kaftanzoglou gave this speech in 1871 during the foundation ceremony of his project for the Church of St. Constantine in Athens. Through the monumental neoclassical composition of the church, but also through the rhetoric of his speech, Kaftanzoglou essentially criticized the romantic neo-medieval architecture of his time. And I quote Kaftanzoglou again, "Many engineers and architects in the West, carried away by metaphysical theories or simply prompted by a prevalent spirit of novelty, have argued that we ought to abandon the rules set by our forefathers, rules extracted from the meticulous study of the nature and the simplest tectonic of the first needs of man, and that we should seek inspiration in those dreary times of servitude and decadence," that's how he describes the Middle Ages, "imitating with precision the architectural models of the artless edifices constructed back then," i.e. the medieval cathedrals. Already since 1846, the architect had argued that the ruins of ancient Greece are and will always be the only rules and teachers of the true art. Now, Kaftanzoglou's persistent belief in classical monuments as the absolute models for architecture demonstrates his adherence throughout the 19th century to what Colquhoun had summarized as the classicist mindset of the 18th century. This is also evident in the fact that Kaftanzoglou never referred to famous contemporary theorists like Ruskin, Zemper, or Viollet-le-Duc, but instead resorted frequently to the authority of 18th century authors such as Winkelmann, Leroy, James Stewart, and Francesco Milizia. What I've tried to show through the case of Kaftanzoglou is that the Greek case does not fit smoothly in the conventional European chronologies of the 18th and 19th century and the transition from classicism to historicism. We could perhaps describe Greek 19th century architecture as a persistent or latent classicism, or even speak of an atrophic or hesitant historicism. But such terms perhaps run the risk of simplifying the complexities of the Greek context and of presenting it merely as a delayed periphery. So to circumvent such potential problems, I will return now to Colquhoun's analysis. As the title of his text suggests, Colquhoun gave three different definitions for the term historicism. Number one, a theory of history, that is, the theory that all sociocultural phenomena are historically determined and that all truths are relative. Number two, an attitude, a concern for the institutions and traditions of the past. And number three, an artistic practice, which boils down to the use of historical forms. And quite crucially, as Colquhoun notes, these three kinds of historicism are to some extent related, but can also appear independently from one another. In other words, a concern for the institutions and traditions of the past, imbued with some degree of historical relativity, did not always lead to an artistic practice that made use of all available historical forms. And this distinction is useful for deciphering the Greek context. In the 19th century, Greek historians like Konstantinos Paparigopoulos or Spiridon Zambelios strove to create a comprehensive historical narrative which contained all periods of Greek history, from antiquity to Byzantium through the Ottoman era and until the present. And they treated all these periods as the successive episodes in the long life of the quote-unquote Greek nation. In doing so, these historians shed light on some lesser known aspects of Greek history, and most notably the Byzantine Middle Ages. However, they still considered classical antiquity as the moment of utmost cultural and artistic sophistication, and they valued the following periods only insofar as they provided evidence for the survival of the culture, art, or language of antiquity. The architects of the Greek nation state were aware of other Greek pasts and of their importance in the national romantic narrative of continuity, but that they did not see their architectures as equally pure or legitimate. When it came to defining the new national style, classical antiquity was the safest option. This brings us to another distinction that Colquhoun draws in his text, namely between historicism and eclecticism. Although he often uses the two terms interchangeably, it seems to me that through historicism, he mostly refers to philosophical and literary modes of cultural relativism, whereas with eclecticism, he describes architectural and artistic tendencies for stylistic pluralism. And once again, Colquhoun asserts that the two were connected, but not always interrelated. In this sense, and bearing in mind the aforementioned discrepancy between Greek historiography and architecture, we could perhaps describe the Greek case as one of historiographic relativism without architectural eclecticism. Greek 19th century historians did develop a historical narrative that aimed, to use Colquhoun's words, to penetrate the essential spirit of the country and the nation and to distinguish its different periods. But when it came to architecture, this historical relativism was pushed aside and classicism was favored over other options as the most recognizable Greek national style. Since we come to the notion of eclecticism, Colquhoun again distinguishes between two different kinds. One in which different styles could exist side by side, and another less obvious kind of eclecticism in which, as he says, one style could come to stand for a dominant moral idea and be connected with an idea of social reform. For this latter definition of eclecticism, Colquhoun uses the example of French architecture in the second half of the 18th century and its return to austere classical forms. And I would argue here that the Greek case also fits this description. Colquhoun's second definition of eclecticism, referring to a strict adherence to a particular style, appears at first as a contradiction in terms. But it does resonate, I would argue, to some extent with the etymology of the word eclecticism. So the term eclectic comes from the Greek verb eklego, which means to choose, but also to elect. In English, the word eclectic or eclecticist denotes, of course, a person who derives elements from a diverse range of sources to construct their own theory, system, or style. The Greek etymology is a bit more complicated. In antiquity, the word eklektikos had roughly the same meaning as in modern English, and with Colquhoun's first definition of eclecticism. And it was used for philosophers who did not adhere to one particular dogma and adopted ideas from different strands of thought. In modern Greek, however, the word eklektikos does not signify a person who picks and chooses from different sources, but rather someone who is particularly selective and choosy, thus resonating more with Colquhoun's second definition of eclecticism. Now, I cannot be certain if Colquhoun had all this in mind when defining the term in 1983, but his second definition of eclecticism as an exclusive attitude of a particular choice rather than one of inclusivity and openness allows us again to avoid treating the Greek context as an outlier and to relate it to broader schemata of 19th century historiography. In conclusion, Colquhoun has provided us not only with three kinds of historicism, but also with several more definitions, distinctions, and bifurcations. This definitely makes his text difficult to follow, but it is precisely in these meanders and dissonances that one can begin writing. It's precisely these meanders and dissonances that make his writing a fertile ground for new historical hypotheses. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful paper, Nikos. I think particularly the importation of classicism into the modern Greek state is particularly fascinating, and I hope that there'll be some more discussion of that. But to move on, I'd like to introduce Cesare Birignani, who is Assistant Professor of Architectural History at the City College of New York. Cesare.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I also want to thank Irina and Mary for organizing this event. It's a real pleasure, in fact, an honor to be speaking here. Can you see my screen? Subspecie temporis, or meditations on historicism and modern architecture. In 2015, in an essay on Alan Colquhoun, Mary McLeod graciously called attention to some difficulties in reading his work. At times, she wrote, his rigorously dialectical, though non-teleological method resulted in conclusion that seemed elliptical or even equivocal, but it was this very quality of ambiguity, or rather it was the absolute lucidity and precision with which he characterized architecture's own ambiguities, its complexities and contradictions, that made him so stimulating to both his peers and the younger generation. I share McLeod's enthusiasm for Colquhoun's lucidity in exploring architecture's own ambiguities, though I'd probably be somewhat less gracious. As I reread Colquhoun's essays on historicism in preparation for this conference, I got practically dizzy in the gyrations of his dialectic, a mode of argumentation that proceeds by constantly setting up antinomies and rarely seems to offer the comfort of firm conclusions. Synthesis in Colquhoun's dialectic seems always to be deferred. McLeod, Kenneth Frampton, and Anthony Wheeler have already offered perceptive readings of Colquhoun and are much more adept than I could ever be in historicizing him. I won't really attempt to do so. Rather, I shall ask, what issues does Colquhoun's work raise today? I would say that it raises two sets of questions, historical and historiographical questions on one side. What was modern architecture? How did it come about? How do we account for historical change? But also what can only be called the philosophical questions. Is there a meaning to history? Is a philosophy of history in any way possible? Colquhoun wrote only a handful of essays specifically devoted to historicism, notably Historicism and the Limits of Semiology of 72, Three Kinds of Historicism of 83, and the introduction to his two essay collections of 81 and 89. Which must, of course, be read in the context of the so-called return to history of those years. Robert Venturi, Aldo Rossi, the Beaux-Arts at MoMA, the Strada Novissima at the Venice Biennale, and so forth. I would argue, however, that the constellation of problems that we associate with historicism were for Colquhoun a lifelong preoccupation. From a sharp review of Rainer Banham's theory and design in the First Machine Age of 62 to the volume Modern Architecture of 2002. A 4-decade-long sustained engagement with the problem of history that remains almost unique. Now, to the matter of historicism. I am fond of a definition offered by Benedetto Croce in 1938 in La Storia come pensiero e come azione, translated in 41 as History as a Story of Liberty, a book I should note that Colquhoun had in his own library. In the scientific use of the term, wrote Croce, historicism is the affirmation that life and reality are history and history alone. This sentence plunges us straight into the fundamental premise of historicism, namely the idea, first argued by Vico in the early 18th century, that we are historical beings through and through, and that we can only know the past because we ourselves made it, verum ipsum factum. But I should immediately add caveats. As has been pointed out by several scholars, historicism is an ambiguous term with multiple meanings and is better understood not as a single system of thought or a coherent doctrine, but rather, in the words of Pietro Rossi, as a family of doctrines, closely linked to one another, but also at times antithetical to one another. In this sense, there seems to be as many historicisms as there are historicist thinkers. Moreover, the assessment of historicism, especially in the historical philosophical debates of the interwar period, is also equally problematic. Friedrich Meinecke in 1936 saw the merits of historicism in having dispelled the belief in the unchangeability of human nature and the idea of eternal truths and absolute values. Raymond Aron in 1938 saw historicism differently, as a pessimistic doctrine, resigned to changed without sense or purpose, a doctrine that replaced the positivist myth of progress that were an ever better future with the disenchanted acceptance of a hopeless becoming. And it was in those years that Karl Popper began formulating his idiosyncratic interpretation of historicism, which would prove to be influential in post-war architectural discourse, above all for its condemnation of all teleological understandings of history. Historicism, he wrote scornfully, in The Open Society and Its Enemies, is out to find the path on which mankind is destined to walk. It is out to discover the clue to history, or the meaning of history. And famously, in The Poverty of Historicism of 57, he called the belief in historical destiny sheer superstition. Colquhoun was surely affected by Popperian skepticism, though he ultimately drew on other traditions of thought, most notably French structuralism. A case in point is the essay Historicism and the Limits of Semiology, published in 72 in Obscit, the journal that John Ockman mentioned earlier, an Italian art and architecture journal that had been especially attentive to structuralist and semiological discourse. Architecture, he argued, could not be analyzed synchronically as one could do with linguistic systems. The diachronic dimension was fundamental. Changes in architecture, like those in language, were revolutionary and intentional. They were directly related to ideology and could only be understood in a historical context. The rules, the codes underpinning architecture were thus normative in the sense that they reflect the attitude, values, and ideology of a particular society. Beginning in the 18th century, it became impossible to regard these norms as immutable, and two opposing viewpoints emerged. On one side, a search for a priori forms that lay behind architectural conventions. On the other, a rejection of the very idea of a priori values, which Colquhoun tied to the new attitude toward history of late 18th century German thought and the consequences of post-Hegelian epistemology, namely the emergence of the idea of historical relativity and of the idea of history as a teleologically oriented process. Once the idea of history as an intelligible process with a predictable future was established, it was no longer possible to believe that a person in a particular period could simply by introspection discover the form of society, the language, and the aesthetic mode that was true for all time. No man could divest himself of his own social conditioning and speak sub specie eternitatis. There were no fixed archetypes to which one could appeal. Instead of trying to discover such Platonic models, man's task was the empirical study of history. Now, sub specie eternitatis, that's Spinoza in the Ethics. It is in the nature of reason to perceive things under certain species of eternity, from the standpoint of eternity, that is, viewed from a universal, i.e., non-historical perspective. And here's the kernel of Colquhoun's dialectic, and the gist of my paper's title, Sub Specie Temporis. In essay after essay, the problem Colquhoun struggled with was the confrontation between eternitas and tempus, between eternity and time or duration, that is the fundamental dialectic between universality and contingency. And it is to this dialectical kernel that we can trace both Colquhoun's lifelong concern with the question of tradition and his absorption in the work of Le Corbusier. The signal essay is Displacement of Concept in Le Corbusier, also 72, a masterful reading of the architect's complex engagement with tradition, in which Colquhoun argued that the constant leitmotif in Corb's work was the modification or contradiction of traditional works. His analysis of the 5 points is memorable. Colquhoun read them in terms of transformation and reversal of the elements and rule system of the academic tradition. Thus, the use of pilotis would be a reversal of the classical podium, and the fenêtre en longueur, a contradiction of the classical window edicule. I'm showing here the entrance facade of the Villa Stein, where Le Corbusier, aware that the horizontal window threatened to remove all coherence from the facade, retained the traditional isolated window, transformed it, and gave it a new meaning. To use that period's semiological jargon, he re-semanticized it. The window on the attic floor is meant to provide the same kind of human referent as was provided by the classical window edicule, but a transformation has intervened and a new meaning has been introduced. The opening ultimately brings the facade to rest, creates a focal point, and indicates the penetrability of the thin surface and its expression as volume rather than mass. Colquhoun returned often to the issue of tradition in architecture. He was not, of course, the first one to do so. One thinks above all of Colin Rowe with the mathematics of the ideal villa, 1947, and mannerism and modern architecture of 1950. Banham in Theory and Design of 1960, but also Manfredo Tafuri in Theories and History of Architecture of 1968, exploring the fundamental difficulty in historicizing modern architecture, namely its claim to be a radically anti-historical phenomenon. I'm showing here a curved sketch of the Forum at Pompeii in Vers une Architecture, which Colquhoun would summon up in a later essay to analyze an early scheme for the Palace of the Soviets. Needless to say, for Colquhoun, Le Corbusier remained the paradigmatic architect to understand the workings of tradition and its interplay with innovation. Colquhoun's preoccupation with tradition is especially acute in the essay Modern Architecture and Historicity, the introduction to his first essay collection of 1981. He outlined there some of the ideas he was to elaborate 2 years later in 3 kinds of historicism. Above all, the dialectic between a normative interpretation of history and a relativistic one, both of which he ultimately rejected. The relativistic view for ignoring that architecture is an aspect of culture and not of nature, and can never escape its ideological role as a representational art. And the normative view for ignoring that architectural meaning is historically founded and cannot be detached from those meanings which architectural forms have acquired from history. More than rejecting this view of these views of histories, Colquhoun called for subsuming them in what he named the hermeneutics of tradition. If criticism is to carry out its function of making judgments, he concluded, it must have at its disposal norms which belong to the architectural tradition, a ground against which to measure and evaluate the contingencies of the present. In 3 kinds of historicism, Colquhoun pushed further on the idea stemming from historicist thought, probing the relation between the historicity of architectural codes, indeed of all cultural production, and what he called the cumulative and normative nature of cultural values, that is, once again, tradition. It seems to me, he wrote in his characteristic voice, at once confident and self-doubting, that it is valid to approach the problem of tradition in architecture as the study of architecture as an autonomous discipline, a discipline which incorporates into itself a set of aesthetic norms that is the result of historical accumulation, which takes its meaning from this. Increasingly, though, Colquhoun would come to distrust the possibility of an architecture that might carry cultural meaning. The possibility, as he said in a conversation with Pierre Chabard, of reconciling historical relativity with the experience of inherited cultural values in a world increasingly and irretrievably deterritorialized by capitalism and technology. Such disillusionment is most evident in the book Modern Architecture of 2002. Much of modernist theorists appeared to him then as belonging to the realm of myth. Above all, the idea of the architect, he wrote, as a kind of seer, uniquely gifted with the power of discerning the spirit of the age and its symbolic forms. A paradoxical development of historicism, whereby architecture would not only be the expression of a society at a particular historical moment, but would itself bring into being that society. It's a paradox of an architecture aspiring to produce the very zeitgeist it was supposed to be an index of. The zeitgeist as both an immanent force driving history and an asymptotic goal to transcend history. In 1962, Colquhoun had taken issue with Banham's thesis that, save for Buckminster Fuller, modern architects had essentially misunderstood the machine age they were trying to come to terms with. 40 years later, Colquhoun too faulted modernist theories for having radically misread the zeitgeist that it had invoked, for having misunderstood not the machine age, but the very nature of capitalism. This is a severe and in many ways a problematic judgment, reminiscent of Tafuri's, even if shorn of Tafuri's implacable historical necessity and of what Frederick Jameson called the paralyzing and asphyxiating sense of futility of any architectural or urbanistic innovation. And yet one is left with a similar, somewhat dispiriting sense of closure, the sense of history of its having come to an end, to some kind of completion, to Hegel's Sunday of life. In this sense, Colquhoun's book might well rejoin the tradition of post-histoire thought discussed by Anthony Widler in his Histories of the Immediate Present, an idea that of post-histoire that was itself profoundly historicist, wrote Widler, an idea, the inevitable, the result of historical thought. Now, let me take out Bucky Fuller. In Banham's Theory and Design, he was the deus ex machina of modern architecture. In Colquhoun's book, he is barely mentioned. The most poignant expression of the late Colquhoun's disenchantment with modern architecture is the essay Lost Illusion, written in 2002 and published in 2009 in his collected essays. He returned there on one of the trappings of historicist thought, namely the quest for a correlation between historical conditions and architectural expression, what Mary Hvattum called the principle of correspondence. The modernists of the first half of the 20th century held on to the belief that their age, the modern age, could replicate the stylistic unity they projected onto pre-industrial societies, and ultimately recover what they construed as an organic relation between architecture and society. This belief for Colquhoun was no longer tenable. After World War II, it was possible to think that the welfare state of democratic government might lead to a unified egalitarian society. But he wrote, such social ambitions do not necessarily entail the idea of a unified normative artistic culture. Modern society was disunited, fragmented, subject to continuous changes in fashion. It was no longer possible to imagine a common system of codes binding together art and society. And he concluded, in suggesting that such a pluralism is an inevitable consequence of late capitalism, I am not implying that capitalism is a totalizing closed system which necessarily resists any attempt at conscious modification by political means. What I am suggesting is that no political modification is likely to effect a wholesale and uniform transformation of cultural forms of the kind that was hoped for by modernists. Colquhoun was careful, maybe over careful, to point out that the quest for unity, for wholesale transformation of cultural production, was not necessarily his own. It was the modernist quest. Ultimately, though, he too seems to have remained trapped in the historicist quest for unity he himself had so lucidly analyzed, a trap whereby pluralism can only be an index of social and cultural crises and must be put in inverted commas. Now, one final half-baked thought. One way to extend Colquhoun's reflections on history might be to say that what set in motion modern architecture was not only the new awareness of history that we name historicism, and I'm thinking here of Henri Labrouste circa 1830, or Le Corbusier in the 1920s, in their effort to reinterpret, make use, and in fact, weaponize history. Fundamental was also a new experience of time. In Infancy and History, Giorgio Agamben wrote that the original task of a genuine revolution is never merely to change the world, but also, and above all, to change time. In this sense, we might bring to bear on Colquhoun's reflection on historicism and modern architecture some arguments proposed by Reinhard Koselleck and François Hartog as to the nature of temporality. The key tools would be Koselleck's categories of space of experience and horizon of expectation. His fundamental question, how in a given present are the temporal dimensions of past and future related, and Hartog's notions of regimes of historicity. We would look at the temporal structure of the modern age, at its zeal for progress and its horizon of expectation opened to a redemptive future, and then trace the shifting relation between experience and expectation, eventually coming sometime in the late 20th century at the crisis of that future, the withering away of all sense of forward momentum, the sense of being marooned in a motionless present, what Mark Fisher called the slow cancellation of the future. I don't know what that history might look like, and I'm not really sure whether exploring these temporal regimes might offer a new vantage point to look at modern architecture. I wish I could ask this question to Alan Colquhoun. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cesare. This is very provocative. I think lots of food for thought. I'm going to move on and introduce our respondent, Mary Hvattum, who is professor at the Oslo Institute of Architecture. Mary.
Thank you, Pat. Let me first say what a joy it has been to get this invitation to revisit Colquhoun's writing and thinking, and all the more joyful to revisit Colquhoun's thinking through the work of Cesare and Nikos, who have taken us through some of those sort of prickly and complicated topics that so concerned Colquhoun, historicism, of course, included. Now, to me, one of the most fascinating things about Colquhoun's thinking on historicism is the incredibly sort of elegant way he teases out its many inherent dilemmas. The way, for example, the historicist relativism turns into a kind of absolutism of its own, into a tyranny of the zeitgeist, one could say, or the way that the alleged modernist break with historicism was based on the most historicist doxa of them all, namely the idea that every age, every epoch has a style of its own, and that a new age demands a new architecture. In that sense, as Colquhoun shrewdly pointed out, the 20th century avant-garde was through and through historicist, a sort of ultimate realization of 19th century zeitgeist thinking. And I was thinking about these points when listening to Nikos's fascinating analysis of the Greek 19th century debate. And I think Colquhoun would have enjoyed it too. And I think he particularly would have enjoyed the tale of Cleanthes and Aristocles, who are like personifications of the rift that Colquhoun is discussing at the beginning of the three kinds of historicism. Aristocles, with a sort of prehistoricist audacity, dares to criticize the past, criticize Justinian and his whole era, a cheek which, of course, for the historicist Cleanthes is impossible. Cleanthes can only scrape and bow to the past, praising it as an expression of its time and its place, and at best try to mimic it. For Aristocles, to speak with Koselleck, which Cesare mentioned, the past is indeed still a magistra vita, while for Cleanthes it had become, I guess, something like heritage, musealized, inaccessible for real interaction. But then I wonder, when Kaftanzoglou and his soulmates insisted on the continued validity of the classical in 19th century Greece, is it really a return to 18th century absolutist classicism, or is it something else? Is it not perhaps some kind of historicist classicism for which the classical is relevant, not because it represents a universal ideal, but because it has a contextual validity, because it's somehow right here and now, i.e. in 19th century Greece, that there are cultural and historical affinities that somehow make classicism timely. Now, Colquhoun's observations on the contradictory nature of 19th century eclecticism shows that he had a very, very keen eye for that difference, I think. Historicism historicizes everything, even universal ideals. And in that sense, this sort of eclectic anomaly that Nikos outlines, perhaps it doesn't make Greece into a delayed periphery, but rather into sort of a historicist case par excellence, where a sort of fulfillment of the historicist dream of correspondence between spirit and style, between epochal condition and architectural expression, which is of course the dream that carries on into modernism and beyond. So in that sense, and as Colquhoun again points out, historicism is inescapable. Even today, it remains a dominant figure of thought. And that brings me to Cesare's wonderful and eloquent tracing of Colquhoun's significance today, which was a real masterclass of historicist thought. And rather than try to add much to it, I would like to go straight to his last point, which is to this very interesting proposal of reading Colquhoun in light of Hartog's regimes of historicity. And I've been intrigued lately by this concept of presentism that Hartog is introducing as a sort of third step of Kosellec's two-step transformation of the historical consciousness. And Hartog described presentism as a world so enslaved to the present that no other viewpoint is considered admissible. And of course, in normal parlance, historicism and presentism are each other's absolute opposites. But if we take historicism as precisely this dream of an epochal match, what Gombrich criticizes as the physiognomic fallacy, i.e. the idea that each epoch has its own unique expression by which it can be judged, then historicism actually could be thought of as the ultimate kind of presentism, cutting each time off from every other, even as one recycles history non-stop. And Colquhoun hints at something like that in several places and in several essays, such as when he links historicism with what he calls the beginning disbelief in the past, which the study of the past has generated, which he wrote in the Historicism and the Limits of Semiology. Or when he, almost as an aside, but still very central, I think, notes that historicism has really no way of understanding cultural borrowing, i.e. understanding how architectural motifs transcend time and space rather than express time and space. Karl Bötticher once wrote that this insistence on a new architecture for a new age had the consequence of leaving the modern age alone in the void. And I think Colquhoun had a very fine sense of that epochal solitude. Now, let me end just by saying that Colquhoun understood very well the problems and the paradoxes of historicism, but he did not for a moment, I think, believe that we could escape it. And I agree with Cesare on that point. On the contrary, he concluded that historicism must still form the basis of our attitude towards history. Now, this is part of what Cesare is taking issue with when asking what Colquhoun's work means today. And that's certainly a question worth asking. So just like Nikos' cheeky Aristocles, who took history serious enough to criticize it, we should certainly continue to question the seemingly inescapable doxas of historicism. And in doing that, Colquhoun is an invaluable companion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mari. That's wonderful summing up and poses some interesting questions. Do we have a little time for some discussion? I'm hoping.
A little. There's also a question from Chan that we've seen in the chat.
Yes. I wanted to perhaps, if I could just pose this to Nikos, and I think also Mary's comment in the chat that address some of the things that Mari has brought up as well. Mary says, instead of seeing Hvattum as opposed to Colquhoun, could we see his position rather as endorsing both nationalism, historicism? His reference to ancient Rome and the Renaissance is appropriate to Italy, just as ancient Greece was relevant to 19th century Greece. and 18th century idealism in his embrace of nature as a timeless model more than the lines of 18th century theory. And I'm going to couple that with John's question because I think they're actually quite interestingly complementary. So John Bilsow asks that, he says, thank you, Nikos. I would suggest that the Greek national discourse of the 19th century is fully consistent with the European, especially German, pan-Hellenic romanticism of the mid-19th century. I disagree that the Greek national choice of style is an anachronistic return to Winckelmannian classicism. In fact, modern Greece, in romantically reconstructing Hellas as the core of the modern nation, led all the nations of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. So I give Nikos a chance to respond to these questions.
Yes, thank you both for such wonderful thought-provoking questions. I think that Mari answered Mary's question more eloquently than I could. It's less a matter, I'm realizing it's less a matter of opposition rather than of overlap. And I think that I now understand that Kaftanzoglou was speaking to two different registers. One was a sort of a very popular nation-building sort of attempt to a general public, and then the other one was perhaps a more literate architectural public. And then to very briefly try and answer Chan's question, yes, of course, what happens in Greece post-1830 has a lot to do with European Philhellenism and Philhellenic Romanticism. And in that sense, this choice of the Greek style as the national style is a natural consequence of this. What I more tried to point out is the fact that figures like Winckelmann continue to dominate the local theoretical discourse. So it seems like people like Kaftanzoglou were at a loss of an appropriate theoretical source, and so they resorted to figures like Winckelmann. I'm not entirely sure. What I omitted to say, for instance, is that another very dominant voice, an art theoretician called Koumanoudis, translates Winckelmann in 1843 or so for the first time in Greek. No other major architectural or artistic theorist is translated into modern Greek at that time. Obviously, a lot of these architects would have read French, Italian, and German, but for me, it's interesting that for some reason, Winckelmann is incredibly important to Greek cultural theorists, art theorists, and architects in 1840 something, if that partly answers the question. But thank you.
Right, yes, thank you so much. Cesare, I wonder if you have some thoughts in response to Mari's questions, the issues she raised, and maybe we can follow with that.
I'll just say a few things about us. Mary's also reference to our talk and regimes of historicity. And I'm still somewhat conflicted whether this notion might actually sort of really offer new vantage points or not simply sort of add nuances to what we already know. I think so this question of understanding the question of temporal dimensions could really open up different ways of thinking about really art. So not just a periodization. So how do we speak of, say, modern architecture, postmodern architecture, and really to sort of overcome some of those conventions that we have at this point sort of internalizing. So shifting the emphasis from, so in this case, it would be from the question of history to the question of time. And I'm still conflicted about those notions on one side because I find somewhat, I find Hartog and to some extent Koselleck somewhat conservative as thinkers. At the same time, there is so this question of the experience of time, especially, I should confess, especially in the past year, has become for me extremely important. I'm thinking now of really, I mean, it's been 15 months that we are in lockdown or in the pandemic. I'm thinking of the sort of discrepancy between, let's say, chronological time, 15 months, that felt like in phenomenological time felt like 10 years. So they're very real. So they're not sort of abstractions. These temporalities, or let's say these shifting or multiple temporalities that we can see. And I think it could be productive to sort of map these onto the history of architecture. So it might offer sort of even just as a new set of categories of vocabulary to discuss a sort of certain revolutions that we already to some extent know.
Yeah, of course, I was thinking of the pandemic too. This is, and of course, the fact that we're doing this on Zoom, which is both wonderful and, you know, painful. So one of the, I'm not going to prolong the discussion because I know we need to move on, but I would say one of the things that both of your papers has provoked in me is a question, and it's really a question. I'm not, but I do pose this as a critical thought, that it seems to me that sometimes it's very difficult to get beyond Colquhoun's own engagement and perhaps investment in classicism specifically, and the ways in which that I'm thinking back to Charles's paper as well, but also it just for me raised so many questions when I read the essay again on 3 historicisms and the idea of this link to national identity or national consciousness, which he specifically references the German context. And Nikos's paper really opens up the possibility that we could be reading Colquhoun then through these different contexts and coming to quite different conclusions, or not. That's what's sort of intriguing about Colquhoun's thinking, is that he does offer these possibilities for testing the thinking, as it were, in historical terms. And yet, I do kind of bump up against the Eurocentrism. I really do. And I find that is a limit that is not absolute, but it's a way in which I do wonder about how we might expand Colquhoun's thinking rather than remaining within those convoluted paths that he's laid out for us. So I think that these have been papers that have posed these questions in really provocative and fascinating ways. And I'm really grateful for the ability to talk in this way and to think about Colquhoun in different ways. So with that, I will conclude, and I think we'll pick up some of these themes in the discussion later. Thank you so very much.